All right, let's dive into an explainer that completely flips the script on one of history's most famous voyages. We usually hear the story of 1492 framed as this tale of pure visionary genius and triumphant discovery. But when you actually dig into the historical records, wow. What we really find is a massive mathematical blunder all wrapped up in a desperate, terrifying fight for survival. Today we're unpacking the reality of a journey that was teetering on the absolute brink of total disaster, spearheaded by a stubbornly confident captain who was just completely wrong about where he was going.
I want you to picture this. You've been stranded at sea for over 2 months. Just endless, black water in every direction. You haven't seen even a speck of land, and the desperation on your ship is so thick you could literally cut it with a knife. While the crew finally hit their absolute breaking point, and they gave their captain a terrifying life-or-death ultimatum. The deal was simple. Find land in exactly 3 days, or you are going into the ocean and we are turning this ship around.
And honestly, looking at their supplies, you completely understand why they were living in a nightmare. The food they brought was literally turning as hard as stone. The salt-cured meat, it was rotting and smelled absolutely foul. And the drinking water they had in barrels was growing this thick layer of algae, tasting so horrific that it actually made the men violently ill the second they tried to drink it. You throw in the rats openly roaming the decks, and you've got the perfect recipe for a mutiny.
Section 1. The Spice Trade Dream. So, why on earth were these men risking starvation and outright rebellion in the first place? To get that, we have to look at the immense lore of the East.
Back then, India and Asia were the absolute centers of global wealth. Europe was basically obsessed with getting their hands on goods like pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, and silk. But there was a massive economic hurdle. These goods had to pass through so many different middlemen before they ever reached Europe, which meant the prices were just astronomical. European monarchs were absolutely desperate to find a direct sea route so they could bypass all those merchants and grab that wealth directly.
Enter a young guy with some massive ambition, Christopher Columbus. Now, he wasn't royalty. He was actually born in Genoa, Italy, back in 1451 to a super modest family of wool merchants. But he hung around the harbor, soaking up all these sailors' tales about India's spices. He was entirely self-taught. I mean, he started at the absolute bottom, swabbing decks, pulling ropes, but he paid close attention. He mastered the winds, learned to navigate by the stars, and sailed coastal routes all the way down to Africa. And that grueling, hands-on education, it gave him the absolute confidence to try and solve the greatest economic puzzle of his time.
Section 2. A massive mathematical mistake. And guys, this is exactly where his incredible confidence completely blinded him to reality.
So let's bust a common myth right now. People back then did not think the Earth was flat. Educated people already knew the Earth was round. The actual debate was about the best direction to travel. The accepted, mainstream theory was that the only viable way to India was heading east. But Columbus, he looked at his maps and came up with his own theory. Since the globe is round, if you just keep sailing continuously west, eventually you're going to drop right onto the shores of India.
But here is the fatal flaw in his logic. His entire plan was built on a wildly incorrect assumption about the Earth's size. He firmly believed the Earth was way smaller than it actually is, assuming there was just a short ocean path between Europe and India. He completely underestimated the true circumference of the globe, and he was blissfully oblivious to the fact that an entire massive continent was sitting right in the middle, totally blocking his path. It was a monumental miscalculation that set the stage for everything that happened next.
Section 3. The pitching process. So, how exactly do you get funding for a mathematically flawed dream? Well, it takes years of agonizing rejection.
He actually pitched King John of Portugal first, but the king's experts reviewed Columbus's math and, very correctly I might add, told the king, look, he's wrong. The ocean is way too big. They're all going to die out there. So he was rejected by the people who actually knew how to do the math. For years after that, he wandered around Europe, relying on churches and friends just to survive, being mocked by a lot of people as a total madman. But he just would not give up. Finally, in early 1492, Spain conquered Granada. That ended centuries of conflict and freed up King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to start focusing on expanding their empire. Even though her experts also warned against it, Queen Isabella took a massive gamble, famously selling her jewels to fund his expedition. His sheer relentless stubbornness had finally paid off.
Section 4. Surviving the Atlantic Ocean. Once the ink was dry and the ships were funded, this ambitious business venture very quickly turned into a psychological thriller for the crew.
Keep this number in your head, 90. On August 3, 1492, 90 terrified men sailed out of the Spanish port of Palos. They were crammed onto 3 tiny ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. We're talking barely any living quarters, getting rocked violently by the ocean waves. A lot of these guys hugged their wives and kissed their kids goodbye, genuinely believing they were about to sail right off the edge of the world and never come back.
Now, initially, the winds were actually in their favor. But as they pushed further west than any European ever had before, they hit something completely bizarre: the Sargasso Sea. Imagine leaning over the edge of your ship and seeing what looks like an endless green meadow just floating right there on the ocean surface. The crew was paralyzed with fear. They honestly thought the ships were going to get permanently glued into this thick seaweed, or worse, that this was the mysterious part of the ocean that just swallows ships whole.
And it gets worse. For sailors back then, the compass wasn't just a handy tool. It was literally their final lifeline. So when they sailed so far out that their compass needles actually started behaving erratically, no longer pointing in their usual direction, the terror was absolute. Whispers started spreading across the deck that they were defying God's will by sailing this far into the unknown. At that point, they lost their final shred of hope.
Columbus wasn't blind. He knew a mutiny was bubbling right under the surface. So to prevent a full-blown uprising, he basically turned to creative accounting. He ran a 2-book deception scheme. Every single day, he'd calculate the true, terrifyingly long distance in his private log, and then he'd casually stroll up to the crew and confidently report a fake, much shorter distance. He literally lied to his men every single day so they wouldn't realize just how impossibly far from home they actually were.
But hey, lies only buy you so much time, which brings us to our next number, 70. After roughly 70 agonizing days at sea, surrounded by rats, choking down foul water, and starving, the deception just stopped working. The crew knew something was deeply wrong. And that brings us right back to that dramatic confrontation on October 9th that we talked about at the start. They cornered him. Columbus, literally staring down his own murder, begged his men for just 3 more days.
Section 5, the accidental discovery. What happens next is just a brilliant testament to how incredibly razor-thin the line really is between historical tragedy and monumental discovery.
Literally, the very next day after his 3-day ultimatum began, the ocean finally gave them a sign. Well, actually a few of them. They spotted a floating green branch in the water, and it still had fresh leaves on it. Then, a piece of hand-carved wood drifted past the ship. Finally, they saw small coastal birds hovering right overhead, and any experienced sailor knew those birds couldn't survive deep in the open ocean. Instantly, the entire vibe on those ships went from murderous rage to just overwhelming anticipation.
And then, the tension finally snapped in the dead of night. At around 2 a.m. on October 12, 1492, a sailor peering out into the pitch black from the deck of the Pinta saw a dark silhouette on the horizon and just started screaming, "Land! Land! Land!" The reaction was immediate. Grown men, guys who were ready to commit murder just 48 hours earlier, dropped to their knees on those wooden decks, sobbing with absolute relief. They truly, deeply believed they had miraculously made it to India.
Columbus went ashore the next morning, planted the Spanish flag, and staked his claim. But here's the kicker. Because of his unwavering, completely stubborn belief in his own faulty math, he looked at the indigenous people, who had already lived there for thousands of years, and confidently called them Indians. He was thousands of miles away from Asia, standing right on the edge of the Americas, yet he went to his grave firmly believing he'd found a new route to India. It is a massive historical era that, amazingly, we still see the effects of today.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to take a step back and think about the incredible irony of this whole story. Did a stubborn miscalculation simply open a new trade route, or did it accidentally ignite a global chain reaction that connected continents while simultaneously bringing tragic destruction to millions of native lives? Because this wasn't some calculated stroke of genius, it was a mathematical failure, pushed forward purely by one man's stubbornness. Yet a guy who was completely, utterly wrong about where he was going ended up unintentionally rewiring the entire history of the world. It kicked off centuries of connection between Europe and the Americas, but it also sparked an era of unimaginable tragedy for millions of native people. The map of the globe changed forever, all because one sailor refused to double-check his math. Just let that sink in for a second and keep at it.